I never thought a few words could cut so deep, but the moment my son spoke them in front of everyone, I felt a cold emptiness settle inside me. "You're useless," he said, and the sound of it echoed through my mind louder than any shout. I have lived most of my life in quiet endurance, carrying burdens no one ever asked about and pretending that nothing was wrong while my heart shrank under invisible weight. For years, I have watched him grow from a small, curious boy into a young man I barely recognized, and through it all, I have remained silent, unable to confront the truth I carried or the fears that whispered constantly that I was failing him. Even as I smiled when he learned to ride his bike and clapped at every school play, deep inside, I was haunted by the sense that I was never enough, that my presence was hollow and my love unnoticed. I tried to cover it with laughter and gentle words, but inside I felt a growing chasm between us, and every day the silence in our home became heavier, as if it was a living thing pressing down on my chest. I have always believed that love could heal what neglect had broken, that patient attention and quiet care could fill the cracks in his heart. But I also knew that my own wounds had never truly been tended, and sometimes I feared that the legacy I would leave him was a pattern of disappointment and unspoken resentment. I watched him now, standing in front of our friends and family, confident and self-assured, while I felt the weight of all my past failures pressing down like stones in my chest. He didn't see the years I had sacrificed, the nights I had spent awake worrying and planning, the small moments of happiness he might have. He only saw me as a figure incapable of providing what he thought he deserved. And in that instant, I understood that there are invisible scars passed from parent to child that are never acknowledged until they flare into moments like this. I tried to steady my breathing and remind myself that this was not the end, that there were choices I could still make and actions I could still take, even though my mind felt paralyzed with shame and hurt. I have spent a lifetime learning to hide my pain behind polite smiles and careful words, and yet here it was, spilling out in the sharp clarity of his accusation. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, assessing my reaction, waiting for me to crumble or respond with anger, but neither seemed right. Neither seemed like the path I had always imagined I would take as a parent. The words echoed again in my mind, and I realized that something inside me had shifted, that this moment would mark a turning point, not just in our relationship, but in the way I viewed myself and my own strength. The boy I raised and the man he was becoming were both intertwined with my failures and my victories, but at this moment it felt as if all the victories had vanished, leaving only the raw truth that I had never fully asserted myself or demanded the respect I deserved. I remembered the countless times I had held my tongue to avoid conflict, the times I had swallowed my pride to maintain peace, and the times I had sacrificed my desires so he could flourish, and yet none of it had mattered. None of it had been visible or appreciated, and the sting of that truth cut deeper than anything I had expected. I felt a surge of emotion that was not anger, but a quiet resolve, a sense that I needed to reclaim a piece of myself that I had allowed to be diminished. I could not undo the past, nor could I force him to see the years of silent devotion I had offered, but I could decide what I would do next and how I would carry myself forward in a way that preserved my dignity and my sense of self. I looked at him once more and forced a gentle smile onto my face, the kind that hid the storm brewing inside, while the world assumed I was unaffected. While my mind raced through memories both tender and painful, searching for the path that would lead me out of the shadow of humiliation into a place of quiet power, I thought of all the moments I had held back words I wanted to say and actions I wanted to take. all the chances I had missed because I feared confrontation or rejection, and I realized that the moment had arrived to break free from the cycle of silence that had defined my life. I would not raise my voice or make a scene, but I would let my actions speak louder than any accusation. I would show him and the world that the measure of a person is not in the words thrown carelessly in a moment of frustration, but in the quiet strength that carries through hardship and remains steady when tested. I could feel the tension building inside me like a tightly wound spring ready to release. But instead of snapping, I held it with deliberate calm, using it as fuel for the careful choices I would make in the coming days. I felt a sense of clarity I had not experienced in years, a map forming in my mind that would guide me from the pain of this moment to a future where I was no longer invisible to myself or to him. I knew it would require patience and cunning to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining appearances while preparing to assert my worth in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. I recalled every slight and every moment of neglect, both given and received, and allowed them to inform a strategy that was quiet yet unwavering. I would move with intention and precision, allowing the truth to emerge naturally without forced confrontation or dramatics. In that instant, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, a recognition that the path ahead was uncertain and possibly treacherous, but also imbued with the potential for profound transformation. I had been silent for too long, and now my silence would be purposeful, my presence deliberate, my actions calculated, not for revenge in the petty sense, but for the restoration of respect and the reclamation of my dignity as both a parent and an individual. I could sense the curiosity and confusion in those around us as they waited for me to respond to his words, but I offered only a serene composure, the kind that suggested I had already made up my mind and that nothing superficial would shake my resolve. I felt the first stirrings of empowerment that came from understanding that my worth was not tied to his judgment or anyone else's, and that the decisions I made from this point forward would define the narrative of our relationship more than the accusations of a fleeting moment. I breathed slowly and allowed myself to feel the depth of hurt and the flicker of hope mingling together as a quiet storm inside me. I would need to act with patience and intelligence to ensure that the lessons he needed to learn would be revealed at the right time in the right way, and I felt the beginnings of a plan forming in my mind, a series of steps that would allow me to reclaim my voice and my presence without causing unnecessary harm, yet leaving no doubt about my capability and resilience. The room felt heavy with unspoken tension as the seconds stretched into what seemed like an eternity, and I realized that the world was holding its breath along with me, waiting for some sign of weakness that would never come. My smile remained intact, and my eyes held a calm certainty that belied the tempest in my heart. I had reached a pivotal moment in my life, a quiet but irreversible shift that would carry me from the shadows of neglect and humiliation into a future where my actions would speak louder than any cruel word. And I knew in that instant that nothing would ever be the same again, and that the path ahead, while uncertain, was mine to shape and walk with deliberate confidence and quiet determination. After that day, I could not shake the image of his face or the words he had thrown at me. They replayed endlessly in my mind like a cruel loop, reminding me of every moment I had felt invisible in my own home. I walked through the days quietly, observing him from a distance, noticing the small habits and patterns that I had ignored before, and each observation added fuel to the quiet storm growing inside me. I began to see the world differently, noticing how fragile pride could be, how easily words could wound, and how the truth often remained hidden beneath surfaces that seemed ordinary. I realized that my own silence had not been weakness, but a choice that now demanded purpose and clarity. I would not allow another day to pass where my presence went unacknowledged, where my efforts were unseen, and where my dignity was compromised. The thought of what I could do to shift the balance occupied my mind constantly, and I began to plan meticulously in ways that were subtle and invisible. I started gathering information quietly, observing his routines, his interactions, and the ways he carried himself. I did not want confrontation, yet I understood that preparation was essential, that knowledge was the first step toward regaining control and asserting the respect that had been denied to me for so long. I felt a sense of calm determination that contrasted sharply with the raw hurt I had felt in that moment of public humiliation. Each step I considered was deliberate. I contemplated scenarios in my mind, imagining outcomes and consequences, and adjusting my approach to ensure that my actions would be precise, measured, and effective. I refused to act impulsively. I had learned through years of quiet endurance that haste would only undermine the authority I was building within myself, and that the long game required patience and intelligence. I thought of all the times I had held back my voice and swallowed my pride, and realized that those moments had prepared me for this. I was no longer the parent who bent under the weight of expectation or ignored my own needs to placate others. I had transformed my pain into focus and my anger into strategic insight, and in this transformation I felt a freedom I had never experienced before. I began to see opportunities where I had once seen only obstacles, noticing small openings in his world where influence and subtle guidance could be applied. I studied his behavior and the people around him, noticing loyalties, hesitations, and unspoken alliances. I did not plan to manipulate cruelly, but I understood that careful observation and timing would allow me to present the truth in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. I reminded myself constantly that my goal was not revenge in the shallow sense, it was restoration, it was the reclamation of my own identity and the teaching of lessons that had never been taught in my home. I was determined to allow actions to speak where words had failed to communicate the depth of feeling and commitment I held. I began to make small changes in my daily routine, shifts that seemed innocuous to others, but that strengthened my position and allowed me to operate with quiet authority. I took control of details I had once overlooked, establishing patterns that ensured my presence was felt without needing to draw attention to it. I began reconnecting with parts of myself that had been neglected in the service of maintaining peace or avoiding conflict, nurturing confidence, self-respect, and calm assurance. I discovered that these small acts of self-care were in fact acts of preparation for a larger confrontation that I envisioned carefully in my mind. I imagined scenarios where my dignity would be restored, where the truth would be revealed without spectacle or drama, and where the lessons that had been unspoken for years would finally be understood. I learned to move through my home with quiet intent, noticing subtle dynamics in the relationships around me and adapting my approach to ensure that every action served a purpose in the larger plan. I allowed myself to feel pride in the small victories, the moments when I felt seen by myself, even if others remained unaware. I realized that self-recognition was a powerful tool and that my validation did not need to come from him or anyone else. I began to cultivate patience, a patience that was active, not passive, a patience that allowed me to watch, listen, and learn before acting. I observed how easily appearances deceived, how often people assumed understanding without knowing the whole truth, and I knew that when the time came, I would reveal only what was necessary, letting the full impact emerge naturally. I developed an internal checklist, a sense of timing and sequencing that would ensure that every step I took contributed to the restoration of my dignity and the assertion of my worth in ways that could not be challenged or ignored.
Each day I felt the tension building as the plan took shape, and I understood that while the world assumed I was calm, I was in fact preparing with quiet intensity. I rehearsed conversations, considered responses, and anticipated reactions, ensuring that no misstep would undermine the slow but deliberate work I was undertaking. I reminded myself constantly that the past could not be changed, but the present and the future were mine to shape, that the humiliation I felt did not define me, but could become the catalyst for transformation and empowerment. I felt a strange mixture of serenity and anticipation, the calm before a storm that I had yet not named, and I knew that the coming days would test my resolve in ways that I was ready for.
I could not fully predict. I focused on maintaining outward composure while internally building strength, a mental and emotional architecture that could withstand the pressures of exposure, judgment, and unexpected betrayal. I noticed how small gestures could signal strength, how subtle actions could shift perceptions, and I began to integrate these into my daily life, cultivating an aura of quiet authority that others could not quite name. I became attuned to the rhythms of my household, noticing the shifts in tone, the unspoken agreements, the patterns that could be leveraged when the moment came. I found satisfaction in these quiet preparations, in knowing that every careful observation, every deliberate pause was laying the groundwork for a transformation that would be undeniable. I reminded myself that patience was not inaction, and that the slow accumulation of insight and strategy would ultimately be more powerful than any impulsive reaction. I felt a growing sense of control over my own narrative, a realization that I could assert my worth in a measured way that left no room for doubt or dismissal, and that the future could be shaped by quiet intelligence rather than shouted words. I understood that the lessons I had been waiting to teach would unfold in time, that the truth would emerge in its own way, and that my dignity would be restored not through confrontation, but through deliberate action and impeccable timing. Each night I lay awake thinking through possibilities, imagining the day when the careful orchestration of observation, patience, and preparation would reveal itself, and in that anticipation I felt both fear and exhilaration. I knew that the path ahead would be challenging and then nothing would be easy, but I also knew that the power of deliberate intention would allow me to navigate the challenges without compromise. I felt the stirring of a resolve that was both gentle and unyielding, a quiet fire that would guide me through the humiliation and betrayal toward the restoration and recognition that had eluded me for so long. And I understood that the time to act was approaching and that nothing could prevent the unfolding of the plan I had begun to shape in the shadows. The battle had been forming in my mind for weeks. I arrived early and allowed myself to observe from a distance, noting the subtle interactions, the shifting dynamics, and the hierarchy that was invisible to most, but clear to someone attuned to the rhythms of human behavior. I saw my son enter with confidence and ease, and I felt the familiar pang of hurt mixed with a careful restraint that would not allow him to see the storm inside me. I watched as he greeted friends and acquaintances, laughing effortlessly and moving through the room with ease, while I remained poised and observant, noting every glance, every gesture, every subtle signal that could inform my next steps. I realized that the dynamics of power and perception were delicate and that patience would be essential. I could not let impatience or emotion guide me, for the plan required calm control and precise timing. I allowed conversations to unfold around me, listening more than speaking, noting alliances and tendencies, and identifying the subtle vulnerabilities in the assumptions everyone carried. I felt a quiet satisfaction in understanding the unspoken currents that influenced how people interacted and how easily appearances could be manipulated when guided with subtle intent. My son approached me at one point, offering a casual nod and a polite smile. I returned it without enthusiasm, without the hint of weakness I had felt on the day he called me useless. I allowed the interaction to be neutral on the surface, while internally I cataloged every nuance and planned future steps. I observed how he spoke to others, how he positioned himself, and how he assumed influence without recognizing that the foundations of perception could be shifted with careful application. I realized that the power of this moment was in observation, in the quiet assessment of relationships, and in the patient cultivation of a presence that was both noticeable and unassuming. I let others lead conversations while I listened carefully, noting topics that triggered defensiveness or pride and those that revealed vulnerability. I began to see patterns forming, patterns that could be leveraged when the time came to assert the truth and reclaim my dignity. I understood that public perception was fragile and that the smallest gestures could create ripples that shaped understanding and belief. I moved deliberately through the gathering with a calm exterior and a focused mind, feeling the subtle currents of tension and expectation building around me. I noticed how easily assumptions guided opinions and how the careful revelation of facts could reshape the narrative entirely. I felt the beginnings of a quiet satisfaction, knowing that my patience and preparation were beginning to align with opportunity. I allowed myself to consider the ways in which the lunch might serve as a stage for subtle assertions of authority and presence, and I realized that timing would be everything. I watched as small conflicts and moments of miscommunication unfolded around me, and I noted how perceptions could be gently guided without overt interference. I felt a growing confidence in my ability to influence without confrontation, to assert without aggression, and to reveal truth without spectacle. I understood that the unfolding interactions were like pieces on a chessboard, each move considered in advance, each response calculated to achieve maximum effect without revealing intent. I could feel the tension rising inside me like a cord being drawn tight. I sensed that the moment when subtlety would give way to revelation was approaching, and that the groundwork I had laid in observation and quiet preparation would soon bear fruit. I remained poised, calm, and unassuming, allowing others to underestimate the influence I was cultivating, while internally I was fully alert to every nuance and opportunity. I knew that patience would remain my greatest ally, that restraint would protect the integrity of my plan, and that the first visible impact would be quiet yet undeniable. The lunch continued with polite conversation, laughter, and routine social exchanges, but beneath the surface, the currents of perception and judgment were shifting imperceptibly, and I could sense the approaching moment when the careful accumulation of insight would transform into action, and the quiet restoration of dignity that I had been preparing for would begin to reveal itself in ways that could not be ignored. The tension inside me was electric yet controlled, a careful awareness of what was coming, a readiness for the subtle confrontation and exposure that would finally allow me to reclaim my presence and assert my worth in the way I had been silently cultivating for so long. The moment came more suddenly than I had expected, a careless remark slipping through the conversation like a shadow I had sensed but not anticipated fully. My son spoke in a way that drew attention, subtly mocking me in front of friends and acquaintances, a casual cruelty disguised as humor. I felt the familiar sting of hurt rise inside me, but this time it was tempered with the quiet clarity I had cultivated for weeks. I did not flinch or respond immediately. Instead, I observed the ripple his words caused, noticing who laughed, who hesitated, who glanced at me, and who looked away. I cataloged each reaction carefully, understanding that the public perception of me could be influenced not by defensiveness or argument, but by the deliberate control of my response. I felt the old pain of years of neglect mingling with a new awareness that this moment was pivotal, the silent breaking point I had anticipated. I could feel the urge to retreat to the safety of invisibility, the instinct to shrink back and swallow my pride, but I resisted, allowing a calm exterior to mask the storm of thought and strategy building inside. I realized that humiliation had been a constant companion in my life, yet it need not dictate the course of my actions. It was in this precise moment that the decision crystallized. I would not allow my dignity to be stolen through impulsive reaction. I would respond with calculated presence, with deliberate action, and with a quiet assertion that could not be ignored. I felt a surge of internal strength, a recognition that the years of silent observation, preparation, and patience had culminated here, that every moment of restraint had been training for this point, and that the careful cultivation of composure and insight would allow me to navigate the public betrayal without losing control. I watched him speak, noting every inflection, every pause, every subtle indication of pride or insecurity. I measured my breathing, maintained my posture, and let my calm authority fill the space. I realized that sometimes the most powerful response was not in words, but in the quiet demonstration of self-possession and integrity. I allowed the tension to exist, letting it hang in the air unacknowledged while I gathered the threads of observation and understanding that would inform the next steps. I understood that the breaking point was not a moment of weakness, but the threshold where deliberate action would transform the dynamics of power and perception in ways that were quiet yet irreversible. I could feel the weight of the eyes in the room, the subtle judgments forming and shifting, and I held myself with an assurance that communicated strength without declaration. I had reached the silent decision, the point where internal resolve met external reality, where preparation became readiness, where the past of neglect and humiliation intersected with the possibility of restoration and recognition. And I knew that the coming days would require precision, patience, and unwavering composure to see the plan unfold fully. After that day, I retreated into a quiet space within myself, a place I had cultivated over years of endurance and observation, where pain and clarity coexisted and allowed me to focus without distraction. I began to map out the steps I would take, not in haste, but with deliberate care, understanding that true influence required patience, planning, and precision. I reviewed every interaction I had ever had with my son, every moment of miscommunication, neglect, and misunderstanding. Each one became data points in a strategy that was forming slowly and meticulously. I understood that the goal was not to humiliate or punish, but to restore dignity, assert my presence, and reveal truth in a way that could not be denied or dismissed. I began by examining my own behavior, the choices I had made, and the ways in which I had allowed myself to remain silent for so long. I reflected on the patterns of avoidance and concession that had become habitual, and I resolved to break them by establishing a new standard for myself, one that emphasized clarity, purpose, and quiet authority. I considered the social and legal frameworks available to me, the ways in which reputation, perception, and factual evidence could work in my favor if applied thoughtfully. I spent hours quietly reviewing documents, correspondence, and past incidents, noting inconsistencies and opportunities to clarify the record without confrontation or spectacle. I cultivated contacts, subtly gathering insight from those who had observed interactions and could provide perspective that was objective rather than emotionally charged. I realized that preparation was not simply about planning actions, but about cultivating presence, influence, and timing to ensure that the eventual revelation of truth would be undeniable. I refined my approach to communication, practicing restraint and composure so that every word and gesture would carry intentional weight. I developed scenarios in my mind, imagining various outcomes and how I would navigate each one with calm authority and strategic insight. I studied patterns of behavior, both my own and my son's, learning how assumptions guided actions, how pride and insecurity shaped responses, and how subtle Cues could be leveraged to shift perception. I began to implement small changes in my daily routine that reinforced my presence and authority without drawing overt attention to myself. I managed my interactions to ensure that credibility, integrity, and quiet leadership were visible to those around me. I cultivated calm confidence in my voice, in my posture, and in the subtleties of expression, understanding that the most powerful influence is often silent. I rehearsed moments of potential confrontation internally, allowing myself to respond, not react, to provocations in ways that demonstrated strength without aggression. I reflected on the lessons of the past, the humiliation, the neglect, the silences that had shaped me, and I allowed them to inform the precision of my preparation. I reminded myself constantly that the ultimate goal was restoration, not revenge, that dignity and respect could be reclaimed through intelligence, patience, and carefully considered action. I identified the vulnerabilities in perception, the assumptions that others held, and the moments where subtle intervention could guide understanding in my favor. I mapped a sequence of events where truth would emerge gradually with undeniable clarity. I prepared documentation, factual accounts, and careful narratives that would support the reality I had endured and allow others to recognize it without doubt. I considered the timing of each step, the order in which evidence and observation would be revealed, and the ways in which public perception could be guided subtly without appearing manipulative. I focused on cultivating patience, a deliberate attention to timing and sequencing that ensured every action would contribute to the larger goal. I allowed myself moments of quiet satisfaction, recognizing that each careful observation, each measured decision, was building toward a moment of undeniable impact. I cultivated resilience to withstand potential setbacks and maintained awareness that not all outcomes could be controlled, but that influence could be maximized through preparation and composure. I reminded myself that power and authority are often perceived rather than stated, and that subtlety combined with intelligence could produce results more effectively than confrontation. I refined my understanding of interpersonal dynamics, noticing how pride, insecurity, and perception intersect, and how each could be leveraged to achieve desired outcomes. I internalized a sense of calm confidence that radiated through small gestures and measured responses. I created mental rehearsals of interactions, imagining how each participant would react and how to guide those reactions to reinforce the truths I needed recognized. I monitored my own emotional responses carefully, ensuring that they remained steady, deliberate, and unassailable. I considered the long-term implications of every choice, the potential for misinterpretation, and the ways in which patience could transform an ordinary moment into an opportunity for assertion and reclamation. I reviewed the narrative of my life as a parent, the quiet sacrifices, the overlooked contributions, and the unacknowledged love, and allowed these reflections to inform my strategy. I recognized that the most effective preparation was internal, the cultivation of a mindset that could withstand provocation, maintain composure, and act with quiet authority when the moment arrived. I observed daily life with heightened awareness, noting subtle shifts in interaction, tone, and perception, and allowed these observations to guide incremental adjustments in my behavior and approach. I spent hours considering the ethics of action, ensuring that my preparation would maintain integrity, respect, and purpose without causing unnecessary harm. I internalized the understanding that influence comes from clarity of intent, intelligence of action, and consistency of presence.
I continued to refine the plan, adjusting for contingencies, considering multiple outcomes, and preparing responses that were calm, deliberate, and effective. I allowed the quiet excitement of anticipation to coexist with the serenity of confidence, knowing that the culmination of preparation would soon meet opportunity. I felt a growing sense of control over my narrative and over the subtle dynamics that had previously left me feeling powerless. I reminded myself constantly that the next stage required patience, precision, and unwavering composure, that the actions I would take now would set the stage for the eventual revelation of truth and the restoration of dignity that had long been denied. And I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that preparation had transformed fear and hurt into focus and power, and that the coming days would reveal the careful work I had undertaken in a way that could not be ignored.
The day arrived when subtle preparation met the opportunity for confrontation. I had arranged everything with careful consideration, timing, and patience to ensure that my presence would carry weight without requiring aggression or spectacle. I entered the space quietly, aware of the perceptions forming around me, noting the expectations, assumptions, and judgments that others carried, as if they were invisible threads weaving a pattern I could navigate and influence. I observed my son moving through the room with confidence and casual charm, aware of how easily appearances could mislead and how deeply the truth of experience was hidden beneath the surface. I did not rush or speak unnecessarily. Instead, I allowed my calm presence to communicate authority, dignity, and focus while internally cataloging each interaction and evaluating the ways in which the narrative of respect and recognition could be subtly reinforced. I watched as conversations unfolded, noting the small opportunities where facts and observations could be introduced without confrontation. I understood that the weight of truth could be revealed quietly through patience and precision rather than raised voices or dramatic gestures. I began by addressing issues indirectly, allowing questions to emerge naturally in conversation and responding with clarity, integrity, and measured confidence. Each answer deliberate, each statement reinforcing the reality I had endured and the dignity I had maintained. I noted the subtle shifts in perception around me as observers began to notice the coherence, consistency, and composure I displayed, the quiet authority that comes from experience, preparation, and self-awareness. I remained calm under every implied challenge and carefully directed every interaction to align with the underlying truth I sought to assert. I allowed my son to speak, assuming control and influence, while I guided perception through measured observation and precise revelation of facts. I noted how assumptions wavered when confronted with clarity and consistency, and how those who had overlooked or dismissed my presence began to reassess their understanding of me. I maintained composure even as subtle attempts at dismissal or manipulation emerged, noting them carefully and countering indirectly through demonstration of knowledge, poise, and calculated patience. I introduced insights in a way that was natural, unforced, and undeniable, allowing others to arrive at conclusions without direct accusation, ensuring that respect was restored not through conflict but through recognition of competence and dignity. I focused on maintaining equilibrium in my own responses, monitoring internal emotions, ensuring that pride did not cloud judgment, that satisfaction did not lead to overconfidence, that every interaction served the larger purpose. I observed the nuances of relationships as colleagues, friends, and family noticed the shifts, imperceptibly guiding understanding toward acknowledgement of my role, influence, and integrity. I allowed small truths to surface strategically, offering clarity where confusion had prevailed and reinforcing patterns of trust and credibility that I had cultivated through quiet preparation. I remained attentive to timing, allowing the rhythm of conversation to create natural openings for observation, insight, and subtle assertion. I understood that the public assertion of authority could be most effective when paired with patience and restraint, when demonstrated through consistent behavior and measured presence rather than dramatic display. I continued to guide perception through subtle emphasis on facts and consistency of demeanor, allowing observers to reconcile prior assumptions with present evidence in their own minds. Understanding, I noted the ways in which my son responded, noting hesitation, shifts in confidence, and subtle acknowledgement of my composure. I did not confront him directly, but allowed the unfolding interactions to reveal the contrast between his assumptions and the reality of my capability and strength. I recognized that quiet observation and subtle guidance could achieve what confrontation alone could not, that the restoration of dignity was most effective when it emerged organically through demonstration rather than assertion. I monitored the social environment, noting how influence flowed, how attention shifted, how respect was recalibrated, and I adjusted my presence accordingly, reinforcing the impressions I intended while maintaining integrity, composure, and calm authority. I allowed the natural rhythm of events to support the revelation of truth, integrating moments of insight into conversations without drawing attention to strategy or preparation. I reminded myself constantly that patience, observation, and subtle action were the most powerful tools at my disposal, and that the cumulative effect of careful preparation and precise timing would ultimately achieve the restoration of dignity and recognition. I maintained awareness of the broader social context, ensuring that each interaction contributed to the overall perception of competence, credibility, and authority. I allowed my calm composure and strategic presence to speak for me in every exchange, reinforcing respect and subtly correcting misconceptions. I noted when observers began to recognize the alignment of preparation and presence, the quiet power that comes from consistent integrity and deliberate action. I allowed these shifts to occur naturally without commentary, intervention, or force, ensuring that acknowledgement emerged from observation rather than assertion. I monitored my own emotions, ensuring that satisfaction did not compromise focus, patience, or subtlety, that every movement, gesture, and word contributed to the unfolding recognition of truth. I allowed the plan to progress step by step, carefully noting reactions, adjusting approach subtly, and maintaining unshakable composure through every interaction. I observed how credibility and respect could be restored through demonstration, clarity, and consistency, and I felt the quiet confidence of knowing that my careful preparation was producing results without spectacle or confrontation. I allowed the unfolding events to guide me toward the revelation of truth, the restoration of dignity, and the assertion of presence I had been cultivating for years, understanding that the final impact would be undeniable because it emerged naturally from preparation, observation, and patient strategic action. The truth began to surface slowly but unmistakably as moments unfolded with the clarity I had anticipated. I noticed the subtle recognition in the eyes of those around me, the slight hesitation in responses, the unspoken acknowledgments that built like invisible threads, weaving a pattern of understanding and respect. I had prepared for this, carefully gathering evidence, observations, and insights in silence over weeks, allowing the narrative of my worth to emerge naturally. I did not need to raise my voice or assert dominance, for the combination of preparation, patience, and quiet presence created its own authority. The room itself seemed to shift as people began to reconcile what they had assumed with the reality now visible in my calm composure and deliberate actions. I could feel the tension that had hung in the air for so long begin to dissolve, replaced by acknowledgement and subtle respect. I observed the small changes in demeanor in those who had previously dismissed or underestimated me, noting the way body language softened, the way expressions registered reconsideration, the way the subtle cues of influence and credibility became undeniable. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the restoration of dignity did not require spectacle, confrontation, or drama, but emerged from consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and calm authority. I noticed my son watching me more closely than he had before, the confidence in his posture slightly tempered by the awareness that the assumptions he had carried were no longer uncontested. I did not speak of past grievances or highlight moments of humiliation. Instead, I allowed the natural unfolding of events to reveal the patterns that had gone unrecognized for so long. I observed as colleagues, friends, and family began to acknowledge my insights, contributions, and presence without prompt or assertion, and I recognized that this was the culmination of months of silent preparation, observation, and patient strategic positioning. I felt the subtle shift within myself, the sense of quiet triumph, not in the sense of victory over another, but in the reclamation of self-worth, dignity, and authority that had long been neglected. I allowed these moments to register internally, feeling the validation that comes from seeing preparation, integrity, and patience produce undeniable recognition. I remained composed, letting the acknowledgement emerge without commentary, ensuring that respect was earned through demonstration rather than claimed through words. I noticed how the recalibration of perception created opportunities for meaningful interaction, the kind that had been impossible when assumptions and misjudgments dominated understanding. I maintained deliberate calm in every gesture, posture, and expression, reinforcing the perception of competence, confidence, and authority. I observed my son navigating the space, his demeanor subtly altered as he registered the shift in perception, the quiet realization that the assumptions of superiority he had held were being re-examined. I did not act on this realization. I allowed it to occur naturally, allowing the impact of prior preparation and strategic patience to manifest without interference. I noticed how social interactions began to flow differently, how questions were directed toward me, how opinions were considered with more weight, and how credibility naturally aligned with demonstrated competence and calm composure. I recognize that true dignity is restored not through assertion of power, but through consistent demonstration of integrity, skill, and patience. I allowed myself to feel the weight of relief, mingled with satisfaction, knowing that the years of silent endurance, preparation, and observation had led to this undeniable acknowledgement. I continued to move through interactions, carefully observing the recalibration of respect, the subtle acknowledgement of authority, and the recognition of worth that had been absent for so long. I noted the small signs, the pauses, the looks, the hesitations that confirmed the shift without needing explicit statements or confrontation. I recognized that the restoration of dignity was complete, not in a single moment, but through the accumulation of consistent perception and recognition over time. I allowed my own awareness to expand, to observe how influence and perception had shifted, the subtle reordering of assumptions in the minds of those around me, creating an environment where competence, calm authority, and integrity were recognized as undeniable. I felt a quiet liberation in understanding that my presence now carried weight without needing to assert it verbally. The recognition had emerged organically from careful preparation, patient observation, and deliberate consistency. I noticed the subtle deference in interactions, the way opinions now considered my perspective, how questions sought my insight, and how authority naturally aligned with demonstrated patience and integrity. I allowed these moments to reinforce the quiet sense of accomplishment that comes from reclaiming dignity and self-worth without confrontation or spectacle. I observed how my son interacted differently now, noticing subtle shifts in posture, tone, and confidence, the quiet acknowledgement of reality registering without comment. I did not need to highlight it. I allowed the natural unfolding of recognition to establish the balance that had long been absent. I continued to maintain composed presence, allowing the culmination of preparation, observation, and patience to be evident in every gesture, response, and interaction. I noticed how others began to integrate the revised understanding into their own behavior, the acknowledgement of competence, credibility, and authority becoming apparent in social interactions. I felt a deep sense of completion, not in triumph over another, but in the reclamation of my own narrative, the restoration of dignity, and the affirmation of worth that had been absent for too long. I allowed the quiet satisfaction of recognition to resonate internally, understanding that the restoration of dignity is most powerful when it emerges naturally through demonstration of integrity, patience, and deliberate composure. I observed the subtle transformation in perception, the recalibration of respect, and the undeniable acknowledgement of presence and worth, and I understood that the years of silent endurance and preparation had culminated in a truth that could not be ignored and would endure. In the days that followed the revelation of truth, I felt a lightness I had not experienced in years. The careful orchestration of preparation, observation, and patient action had created a space where my presence was no longer invisible, where my worth was acknowledged and my dignity restored. I moved through life with a calm confidence that had been absent during the long years of silent endurance and unspoken disappointment. I began to notice details that had previously escaped me, the subtle interactions, the gentle recognition in glances, the quiet appreciation of effort and presence that no longer required overt assertion. I allowed myself to experience the relief of not needing to prove anything to anyone anymore, because the truth had emerged on its own merit and recognition had followed naturally. I felt the freedom that comes from understanding that validation need not be demanded, and that respect is most enduring when it is earned through consistent integrity and composure. I began to reflect on the journey that had led me here, the years of quiet endurance, the moments of unseen effort, the times I had held back words to preserve peace, and the deep understanding that patience and deliberate action are often more powerful than confrontation. I acknowledged the pain of betrayal, the sting of words, and the lingering shadows of neglect, and allowed them to inform a new perspective, a perspective rooted not in resentment, but in understanding the dynamics of human behavior, the limitations of assumptions, and the power of measured presence. I recognized that my own growth had been the most important achievement, that the reclamation of dignity had begun within and manifested outwardly through deliberate and thoughtful action. I spent time cultivating moments of self-awareness, appreciating the strength that had emerged from years of quiet struggle, and the clarity that comes from having endured humiliation and emerged resilient. I allowed myself to reconnect with passions, interests, and activities that had been neglected in the service of maintaining appearances and avoiding conflict. I discovered that peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of self-recognition, calm acceptance, and intentional focus on what can be controlled. I practiced patience with myself and others, allowing imperfections to exist without eroding the newfound equilibrium. I noticed how interactions with my son changed, not because I demanded acknowledgement, but because the balance of understanding had shifted naturally. He treated me with subtle respect, the way a person naturally adjusts when the narrative of perception aligns. With reality, I did not seek reconciliation for its own sake. I allowed space for the relationship to evolve organically while maintaining my own boundaries and self-worth. I observed how my calm confidence influenced others without effort, how integrity and composure created a quiet authority that drew attention and respect. I allowed myself to feel the satisfaction of a life reclaimed, the sense of self established, not through assertion or confrontation, but through deliberate preparation, action, and quiet intelligence. I began to see the long-term effects of restoration in my daily life, the subtle changes in perception, the shift in social dynamics, and the internal sense of freedom that comes from knowing that dignity is intact and self-worth is no longer contingent on approval or recognition from those who once denied it. I allowed myself to experience the joy of small victories, the appreciation of subtle acknowledgement, the gentle affirmation of presence that had been absent for so long. I began to invest in my own growth, the cultivation of skills, confidence, and awareness that reinforced the restored equilibrium. I noticed how the world responded differently to calm authority, how actions aligned with integrity command respect, and how subtle presence can influence perception more powerfully than overt displays. I reflected on the lessons of patience, preparation, and strategic observation, understanding that these qualities had allowed me to navigate betrayal, humiliation, and public dismissal and emerge with dignity and tact. I felt gratitude for the internal strength that had carried me through the long journey, the resilience that had enabled me to convert pain into focus, the wisdom that had guided careful, deliberate action, and the clarity that had ensured recognition and restoration emerged naturally. I allowed myself to savor the quiet freedom of being seen without needing to perform, to be validated without needing to assert control over perception to maintain respect without imposing it. I recognize that self-worth is strongest when internal and independent of external validation, and I felt the profound peace that comes from living in alignment with this truth. I spent time reflecting on the contrast between the years of neglect, silence, and unacknowledged effort, and the present reality of calm authority, recognition, and restored dignity. I acknowledge the emotional growth, the intelligence applied in preparation, and the deliberate patience that had enabled the transformation. I observed my interactions with family, friends, and colleagues, noting the subtle improvements in communication, understanding, and mutual respect that had emerged from the recalibration of perception and acknowledgement of truth. I allowed myself to feel the quiet joy of being fully present in my own life, the liberation of not needing to defend past actions, the freedom of not carrying the weight of unacknowledged effort, and the contentment of knowing that preparation, patience, and integrity had produced lasting results. I noticed how the restored equilibrium allowed space for authentic connection with others, not because I demanded it, but because the balance of respect, perception, and understanding had shifted naturally. I engaged in conversations with calm attentiveness, allowing listening, reflection, and thoughtful contribution to guide interaction. I observed the subtle ways in which trust, credibility, and influence were reestablished through consistent behavior, integrity, and composure. I allowed myself to feel pride in the quiet achievement of having navigated betrayal, humiliation, and public dismissal without resorting to aggression or drama, relying instead on intelligence, patience, and deliberate preparation. I noticed how each day reinforced the restoration of dignity, how each interaction confirmed self-worth, and how the quiet acknowledgement of presence became a sustaining force in daily life. I allowed myself to savor the sense of freedom, the absence of fear, and the emergence of confidence grounded in experience and careful action. I reflected on the journey, understanding that every stage, from silent endurance to preparation and strategic assertion, had been necessary to reach this point of inner peace and external recognition. I continued to nurture the calm authority that had emerged, observing the subtle recalibrations in perception and allowing the results of careful preparation and measured action to unfold without interference. I felt a profound sense of completion, not in a need for revenge or reconciliation, but in the quiet acknowledgement of my own worth, the restoration of dignity, and the liberation of self from the shadows of neglect and humiliation. I allowed myself to live fully in the present, appreciating the clarity of mind, the calm confidence, and the quiet joy that comes from knowing that respect, recognition, and self-worth are established not through conflict, but through deliberate preparation, observation, patience, and integrity. I moved through life with a serene awareness of the value of presence, of consistency, and of quiet strength, understanding that the lessons learned would guide future decisions, interactions, and personal growth. I felt the enduring satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, and the profound inner freedom that comes from knowing that self-worth is independent, secure, and unwavering. And I carried this awareness forward, embracing the peace, patience, and quiet confidence that would sustain me for the years to come.